Hey guys, welcome to the Massive Iron Channel. I'm Steve Shaw. In this video, I'm going to tell you why Faz doesn't know shit about RIR, RPE, and deloading. Before I get into that topic, if you have any questions or comments, drop them down below. The best topic ideas I turn into videos just like this. Please follow FAZLIFTS on YouTube at FAZLIFTS or Instagram at FAZLIFTS. And Faz, you have a podcast as well.
Yes, I do. Yep.
And I wouldn't recommend watching it because Faz doesn't know what he's talking about when it comes to deloading or IRI or RPE. And for anybody that thinks I'm serious, I'm just joking. So Faz, let's set the table a little bit. You made a video yesterday, and I believe RPE and maybe RIR were in the title, and you were talking about deloading as well. And a lot of times when a coach makes a video, a couple things happen. Number one, not everyone listens to the whole video. Not everyone is capable of processing it in its fullness where they're at. And that's not a dig on people. You know, we're all at different levels of education and understanding. But some people, there was a couple comments, one in specific, and I'm certainly not calling the guy out. I appreciate him asking the questions, where it kind of pitted me against you, Faz, me against you on deloading and on RPE, RIR. So you want to talk about, just set the table a little bit with that.
Yeah. So I made this video yesterday, and there were a couple of questions, and it was good to hear them because there was clearly some misunderstanding, and I wanted to, I talked to you, and I wanted to kind of set the record straight because I think the message that I was giving out was maybe not received quite as well. So if there's some questions, then I want to educate people, and with your help, Steve, we can just hopefully clear through this. So firstly, I guess I just want to define what RPE and RIR is. It's basically just a measure of training intensity, just a measure of how hard you work. Okay, that's all I was sort of trying to say yesterday, was essentially saying that it's good to have these this lingo so we can have an open discussion around the world, so we all are on the same page and we can discuss what we think about whether we should hold some reps in the tank or whether we should go all the way out. That's it. Just the measure is useful to have so that I can have a discussion with Steve, Steve can have a discussion with the next guy, so we're all talking in the same universal language. Just like we all know that this is a mug of tea, like we can talk about it, and so we can communicate our ideas and expand the knowledge base. Now, where I kind of want to lead this discussion is where I think it went wrong, is looking at where the use of keeping some reps in the tank versus going all out is appropriate and when it's not appropriate.
Yeah, so I just want to say, you know, when it comes to RP and RIR and even, you know, certain subjects, people are like, he's very much against it. I'm not really against things so much as, you know, these are tools we're talking about. They're not mandatory, and I'm not against them. But some people need to slow down and build the foundation first before they start worrying about, like, people come to you and me, Faz, and you know, I'll let you take over from here. But people come to us and they're like, "What about this? What about that? What about, you know, all this complication?" And they haven't even worked out, you know, for a year without missing a substantial block of training. So it's kind of slow down, get the fundamentals in place, and move from there. As far as your comment about RPE and RIR, you know, we all as coaches have some way of conveying to those we work with how hard we want to set. Whether you call it RPE or RIR, those are constructs that I don't use. You know, I use a different language, which doesn't mean I'm against RP and RIR in the right circumstances.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the language you use with your clients is completely up to you. My point with the video yesterday was simply to say it's good to have universal terms. So when I say RIR, you understand what I mean, and vice versa. But anyway, so looking at its misuse. Now, here's kind of where I think we need to dig in and understand that not every piece of advice on the internet is going to be applicable for every person. As a general rule, I won't really discuss RIR or RPE with any of my clients who are below about 3-plate bench, 4-plate squat, 5-plate deadlift. And I might talk about those things with clients who are stronger. I have some clients who are stronger on more of a conjugate type of template. And with them, there is definite talk about RIR and RPE when it comes to anything but the sort of max effort lifts, because max effort would be quite literally 10 RPR, 10 RPE, because it's work as hard as you can. And some of the other lifts might not be going quite as hard, but it allows me to communicate in a language that everyone understands what to do with certain loads in the gym and certain parts of the routine. But I think the most important part of what I've just said there is it's not something that people need to worry about when they're not at that advanced stage. And it's not something I discuss with my clients when they're not at that advanced stage.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. You know, my YouTube channel and those I try to work with are you know, I've worked with some advanced power lifters, and things are approached differently, but the people I work with are just average Joe and Jane on the street, and we're trying to get, you know, the fundamentals in place. We're trying to get the foundation laid, and it takes a while, time under the bar, to understand the nuances, especially of the bigger lifts. So, you know, taking a bench set to failure, and we're trying to judge RPE and RIR. It helps to understand bar speed. Okay, when you watch a video and you see the bar speed slow, but the rep was still completed, well, there's degrees even in there, nuances. There's just a easy grinder, but there's bar speed slow. That could be a 9.5 or whatever it is. And then there's a really tough grind, or an easy grinder, which could be a 9.0, and a really tough, barely made it out alive grinder, which could be a 9.5 or whatever you want to do. But then the problem is you take this over to squats and you take this over to the deadlift, and you can have kind of squats can mess with your head. You can kind of have a grindy squat and then come back and hit 3 more reps. So my only point is, it takes a lot of time under the bar even to be able to process some of this stuff for different lifts.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the analogy that I was talking about with Steve just when we were off the air is I have a lot of contest prep clients. So I was in bodybuilding physique contests, and one of the strategies that I employ for those guys and girls is carb cycling. And carb cycling works extremely well when you're already relatively lean and want to get very, very, very lean. Now, if I start talking about carb cycling, it's not to say that all of you guys need to be doing carb cycling. If you're not already in that sort of 12% range and want to get down even further, down to the 8%, 6% range, it's really not going to offer that much more of an advantage over just regular dieting. You don't need carb cycling at that point. You just need to go on a diet. So there is a level of appropriateness, and it's important to understand that not everything is appropriate. So when it comes to stuff like RPE and RIR, I personally don't discuss that with any of my clients below about there, because up until that point where you are that advanced, there are other things to talk about, like intensity of effort. Also, just getting your basic lifestyle in order as well. Just making sure your diet is in check, your sleep is in check, your stress is in check, and you are working hard and your form is reasonable enough that you can lift heavy and hard without getting injured. I think those are bigger rocks to put into place before we get into the intricacies of trying to pull setbacks. You can't talk about pulling a set back before you've even taken it all the way, and you've done that for a number of years and continue to get better and better. And one last thing I'll end with is, for the first probably 6 years of my training life, I continued to reach new plateaus of training intensity. One year I thought I was working as hard as I could. The next year it was usually 1 or 2 sessions where I unlocked a new level of intensity and I kind of leveled up. And I did that for the first 5 or 6 years of my training life. And I was relatively strong in those first 3 or 4 years. It was about 8 years after we first met, Steve. And so over those years, I was already learning to work harder and harder and harder. So a lot of this stuff, if you're pulling yourself back and listening to people saying that might apply to me, bear in mind, you may not have reached the point where you are truly working extremely hard, even though it might feel like you are. And you'll know you are because you'll be getting results. It's part and parcel of it.
Right. You know, there's one thing that's going to end up on my tombstone, and that is a statement I've said probably a million times in articles and on videos over the last 20 years. Push your set for as many reps as possible. Stop that set when you feel like your form is going to break down, when you feel like you might fail on the next rep. That's my teaching tool to help people understand how far to push a set. You don't want to push it to the point where you're injuring yourself. And if you think you're going to fail the next rep, you definitely want to shut down. This is just kind of a basic level of communication that I use to help people connect on a basic level with how hard they should be training certain sets. Now, Faz, I want to talk real quick. Misuse. There are a lot of coaches out there on the internet and on YouTube that will elevate these principles to almost a hyper degree of importance for people that really don't need them. And I consider that coaching irresponsibility, because so many people get confused. There'll be videos on this and there'll be no context. And then look, I had a client come to me. Here's a perfect example. I had a client come to me 6 weeks ago, and he was being coached by a 27-year-old physique god on the YouTubes who had probably 10 times more subscribers than we'll ever have. And the dude said, week 1, I want you to push this exercise to 5 reps, 5 RIR. And week 2, 4 RIR. And week 3, 3. This guy had no clue what he was talking about. So, Faz, what's your general thoughts on misuse by coaches who elevate this stuff to the point where all it does is make training harder for those that are?
So I think those coaches potentially don't understand the appropriateness. So I'll give you a bit of an analogy, and this is not aimed at anyone in particular in the YouTube space, but there are certain people out there who really, really like the idea of main gaining. Okay, now it just so happens that those people are also on the older side. So they're maybe after 45 years old. They've had a history of anabolic misuse. So their health is probably somewhat degraded. And as a result, they probably don't want to gain a lot of weight because it'll be bad for their health. But it would be nice if those people had the wherewithal to understand that if you are a young 20-something YOLO who's underweight, and it's probably in your best interest to bulk and not main gain, because no one's main gaining to a great physique at 135 pounds. So I think with those coaches, they potentially lack the insight and critical thinking skills necessary to understand that their advice isn't always appropriate for everyone. And that's kind of, I think, what we're really talking about today. Back when we were on the MAB days, there was this whole talk about volume, intensity, and frequency, if you remember. Right. And as intensity, goes up, volume and frequency need to go down, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that kind of is heart at the discussion of what we're talking about here. I think some of those coaches, they maybe emphasize volume and frequency more than intensity. However, the caveat is, if you're a young YOLO who can barely bench 2 plates, you're not really in a position to say your intensity is super high. So you don't really want to pull it back. Your intensity is probably just not there. And so you need to spend some time learning and perfecting the art of working hard, because it's an art, it's a skill. And you need to practice that first before you think about pulling reps back and maybe supplementing with more volume and intensity, volume and frequency.
Just a couple points before we move on to point number 3. For those listening, MAB is Muscle and Brawn, a website I used to own. I sold. Don't go over there now because it's trash. And volume, intensity, and frequency, how I've been basically viewing it over the last decade, is like a 3 points on a triangle where the balance point is in the center. If you add intensity, volume, and frequency, probably have to go down to adjust. Faz, you put together some points, and point number 3 is defining load fatigue management strategies such as deloads, block periodization, etc., wave loading. Talk about that a little bit.
Okay, so this is an area where I probably am a little bit biased personally. I have a fondness for planned deloads, and I'll explain to you guys why. However, I will say again, I do not use this with all my clients. I use this with certain clients after a certain point. But let's just define what we're talking about. Firstly, there comes a point in everyone's career where they have to manage their fatigue. Now, a truism about getting very, very strong is that you have to work very, very hard. Okay, we all know that. Now, another truism is it's also very hard to recover from very, very hard training. So at a certain point, you reach a juxtaposition where the amount of work you have to do to progress further exceeds your capabilities to recover. And that is where you have load management strategies such as week-to-week wave loading, periodization, deloads. These are all part and parcel of the same thing. For example, the conjugate system works around this by using 3-week waves quite a lot. So that helps to just modulate the intensity up and down. I also sometimes use deloads, not always. And I also use wave periodization and things like that. So what we're talking about is load fatigue management strategies for that juxtaposition of the amount of work you need to progress versus your recovery capabilities.
So when it comes to deload, I think this is something where it's easy to misinterpret my opinion and think me and Faz are going to war. Like what I am against is arbitrary deloads. Back when Wendler's 531 first came out, there was having people deload every 4th week. And I'm like, you guys have no business deloading every 4th week because you haven't gotten to the point where you're training hard yet. Like you're wasting time by deloading. And I still believe that's true for the average individual that believes they have to deload every 4th week. First, let's get the wheels on the bus and start driving. With my clients, and this as well, and anybody watching needs to understand this, everyone is different. I can give the same style of workout to 2 guys, and this is true right now as I'm going to go through client messages today. Excuse me. One guy knocks it out in 54 minutes. The other guy is saying it's 2 hours and 45 minutes. I can't possibly finish. So as a coach, I'm not going to go in and arbitrarily plan deloads. What we're going to do is learn the client. We're going to learn how the client reacts. We're going to see if this is too much volume for the client and pull it back. And we're going to get things in place before we start thinking about how to structure time off. Now, a couple other points. My clients, once they are in the groove, we typically aim to train 3 months at least hard, and then we're going to hit a mini cut where we're going to deload or decondition the body with no pushing for PRs, no pushing in intense, stop sets, supersets, rest pause. So there is structure in there. But it really, with the individual, it can be after 2 months, it can be after 3 months. It really depends on our communication and how things are going. So when I say arbitrary, I'm not going to give a deload to the same to everybody at 8 weeks or 12 weeks. It's going to be person by person. Now, one other point about this that we have to think about in the real world is that you're going to get sick this year. You're going to have vacations this year. You're going to have celebrations this year. And all those times are going to be times where you're going to take off from the gym. So we have to put that on the calendar first. And maybe use that as a, okay, these are going to be our deload times that we can't avoid. And from there, we kind of look at the bigger picture. So that's kind of how I approach deloading. I'm not against time away from the gym. I'm certainly not a fool, but, I do not like arbitrary. Do I have to, I read on the internet that I have to deload every 8 weeks. No, that's bullshit. Right?
Yeah. So I'll explain my position, because how I got my start with deloads is very much how I program them now. And back in the sort of early 2000s, I kept hitting a wall in regards to my training, and I was probably a late stage intermediate, and I couldn't think of what to do. And this is before I met you, Steve, so I didn't have anyone to ask for advice. So I emailed a guy called Dan John, and he messaged me back and he said, "Look, Faz, this is what I want you to do. I want you to go through your training log and just see when you start to run into problems." And I found that arbitrarily, every sort of 3 or 4 weeks, I would run into an issue. And so I wrote back to him, and he says, "Okay, this is what you're going to do. Deload at that point." I said, "Okay, cool." So that's what I did. And that next year is when I just exploded in strength. I was doing everything right up to that point. I was a competitive powerlifter. I was eating right, did everything right. The only thing that changed was the deloads. So what the deload allowed me to do was to progress further. Now, the key point in all of this is not like Faz loves deloads. But the key point in all of this is I looked through my own training log. I took note of what I was doing and when I hit a wall, when I needed a deload. And that is what Steve is just saying he does with his clients. And that is what I do with my clients. And it's very similar to what I was explaining yesterday with what Mike T's philosophy is in his emerging strategies way of coaching, is that he starts with the client, looks at when they hit a wall, and aims to apply some sort of load management strategy before that point. So that's better than a top-down block periodization model because you're working from the bottom up. You're looking at your client, you're observing them, and you're seeing when they need to have some sort of load management strategy in place to enable them to progress further. That's what I did when I first started. That's how I work with my clients. And whatever that week is whatever it is. Whether it's 3 weeks, whether it's 12 weeks, it doesn't matter. As a typical rule, none of my guys currently purposely deload. So as in planned deloads who are not quite at the, say, 2-plate bench, 3-plate squat, 4-plate deadlift point yet. Once they're past that point, some of them might do. That's roughly when I needed to do a deload, or at least apply some load management strategy. But I just want to point out again, like there's a lot of misunderstandings around the whole deload process. Nobody should be deloading if they don't need to. Like there's no advantage of taking time off the gym or taking time off heavy weights or a lot of volume if you don't actually need to. What should technically happen is you should finish the deload and you should come back stronger. If that happens, you've usually aimed it right. And it should be done and worked out via the individual response. Just like I'm saying, just like Steve said, just like Mike T says, you work with the individual. That's what you're paying your coach for, to figure out when you need to apply load management strategies and then apply those. And it could be deloads, it could be block periodization, it could be wave loading, whatever it could be. I know Natural Hypertrophy recommends weekly wave loading. So it's just some type of load management strategy. But it's all done with the client. Sorry, Steve.
No, I was going to say, you know, once you become an intermediate, and this is actually how I started structuring a lot of workouts, you know, 10 years ago when I was on Muscle and Strength, intermediate style workouts, we would have basically nonlinear periodization. You'd have a hard week and then a different type of week. That could be volume and rest pause. That could be more intense, heavier work, and then maybe a rest pause week or a different type of approach, or where you drop intensity and do more volume. So, you know, I'm big on that with intermediates that aren't going to compete. We might have to try to cycle intensity some way, you know, somehow. When someone, I want you guys to understand this when you're watching, when someone comes to you as a client, the first thing you need to do is try to understand what makes this person go. How does the skull crusher hurt his elbows? For some 4 sets of squats, love it, right? For some, it's got to be 2 sets of squats. For some, they like front squats and back squats. Some hate front squats. So if you're with a coach, a good coach, that first couple of months is going to be like the dating period when you first meet somebody. There's a lot of romance. You're going to learn a lot of things. Mm-hmm. And then when you get all the pieces and parts in place, then you can start to run. And the clients that I work with in the long term, we have defined strategies of how we're going to do that. And I'm not against learning anything new. I mean, FAST brings some interesting points up about, you know, strength additions and more frequent dead loading, and that's something you notice. But most of us, let's be real, we need to get to the point where we can actually discern that that's happening, and that requires a track record of hard training.
Yeah, and I'll just say at this point, perhaps this is my fault for not putting more disclaimers in my video, so I'll just apologize to the audience here just to say, if what I'm saying isn't always clear in terms of the audience I'm speaking to, I'll try and do a better job of that in the future. In terms of what you said, Steve, with regards to like getting clients up to speed, you know, I have a great example of that right now. Is I have a client on the books he's an older chap, and he wants to go about cutting some body fat, but he has some dysfunctions, which, and if you dig into what his routine is, he's got chronic pain, he's got visceral fat accumulation, he's got various injuries he's picked up over the years, and he's not very flexible. So you lift the hood up and you start to see there are a million and one things wrong with his diet, with his sleep, with his stress levels. Fixing all of those things is going to deliver a far greater bang for the buck than trying to mess around with any kind of like drastic levels of programming. We need to get the big rocks in place first. And this is really at the crux of what me and Steve are saying when it comes to finding out what's missing, okay? Rather than try and dump a stuff of extra things on top of advanced sort of techniques, let's just try and plug the gaps first. That will offer more bang for the buck for somebody than trying to throw in a bunch of advanced techniques. And going back to your example, Steve, of the young something 27-year-old online coach with all these ideas about high volume and stuff, have they got those building blocks into place? Because I know that this client of mine, he actually came from one of those young online YouTube coaches, and they didn't touch upon any of this stuff. They didn't look at inflammation in his diet. He was on a if it fits your macros diet with a bunch of processed foods, and he had a lot of chronic pain. I mean, you know, for me and you, Steve, that automatically rings alarm bells. It's obvious, right? You sort out some of your food intake, some of that chronic pain is going to start to dissipate. If you're eating a bunch of processed crappy foods, then no wonder you're in pain. And so these are all things which we need to get in place first before we can apply a bunch of more complicated things. And those are the big rocks we need to get into place.
I hope this video helps unpack and helps people understand the difference between coaches and bullshit artists. And, you know, the way me being direct, you know, I'm not attacking anyone specifically, but there are a lot of people out there that'll try to baffle you with bullshit. You know, put together overly complicated wizardry that looks good on paper because, quite simply, they don't have the experience or the you know, the level of coaching maturity to understand that's not really what coaching is, right? You know, coaching is like you know, what you just talked about. Like I had a client the other day who lost 3 reps on his bench just out of the blue. Like there's something going on there that we need to figure out because that's super abnormal. And, you know, we don't just, it's not as always, there's a degree of stick to the program, you know, let's just see if it self-corrects. But coaching is far more than putting together a bunch of random deloads, RIRs, and you know, complicated periodization schemes. That's not coaching. Coaching starts after you give somebody a program. Now, Faz, I appreciate you taking time. This is going to be a long video, but hopefully some people get some good information from it. Strength training. I got to ask you this because we're talking about fatigue management. It seems like everybody wants to go hard and heavy every week. And I had Stan Efforting on my channel a couple years ago, and he talked about this off season. Yeah. Stan's one of the strongest men in the world. And he goes, off season is a lost art where we do some muscle building, some power building, some base building, and we don't always go balls deep, excuse my, you know, crudity, but what are your thoughts on that? I mean, you talk about fatigue management and you have guys that are really strong, but they're going, and they don't have blocks where they're building, you know, doing more reps or doing more hypertrophy stuff.
So, yeah, I mean, a couple of things that I do just straight off the bat, and I agree with Stan and you with this, and I think most good coaches would. A couple of things I do off the block is I tend to use high repetitions in the off season, and I tend to use variations of the main lifts which are designed to build the areas which the client is lacking. So to give you kind of a real life example from me, when I was competing, my favorite assistance exercises for the squat, bench, and deadlift were the high bar squat, beltless. It was the close grip bench, and also the stiff leg deadlift, beltless. So what I did was gradually over the course of the year, and the reps were in the 8 to 12 range. And what I did was over the course of the year, I would progressively work my way down in repetitions and progressively work my way through the variations. So I was hitting something more specific because, as we know, the power lifts are designed to be as short range as possible, like the low bar squat uses as much leverage. But that's not necessarily the best for building strength or for keeping your joints in one piece. So I'm very much in Stan's camp when it comes to this. I think there is a building period and I think there's a testing period, and you don't want to spend all of your time in the testing period. I will say, I think if you are a powerlifter, it's probably useful to do some heavy work all year round. So I know that I do my over warm-ups. I know, Steve, you do like a top set type of approach. So I think having some heavy work in there is okay, but maybe 10%, just like Louis would do for Westside. But yeah, I think you've got to spend a lot of time building because that's ultimately what influences how strong you're going to be. Yeah, what do you think about that?
You know, when I was peaking for my, you know, trying to reach a 1,900 pound total, peaking for a meet where I was going to attempt that, or more, I was going to war. It was heavy. It was daily max singles and not a lot of assistance work. That was peaking. That was gaining confidence. That was, but in my day-to-day training, generally I peak to a max daily set on squats, bench, or deads, meaning it could be a double, a triple, a quad, or whatever, and then I do back off volume work. That's my off season. So right to your point. So to wrap this up, Faz, your point number 4, discussing when these become appropriate to implement on a planned basis. For those that are watching, what's the bottom line take home when deloads and RIR and RPE, when do they need to consider, starting to worry about this stuff?
Okay. I think if you've got your lifestyle factors in place, okay, first thing, if you are genuinely working extremely hard in the gym, if your diet is conducive towards gaining strength, and you're still running into a wall on a regular basis, you will know when you need something else. Now, as a general rule, because I work with a lot of people, as a general rule, load management strategies usually come into play after about 2-plate bench, 3-plate squat, 4-plate deadlift. RIR and RPE stuff might come into play after about 3-plate bench, 4-plate squat, 5-plate deadlift. So these are quite advanced numbers. So RIR and RPE is something which I use a lot later on. Deloads, late stage intermediate, I guess. If you're not at that point, you won't need to. And you'll know immediately that you'll need it, because as soon as you apply something, you'll see almost miraculous results like I did many years ago.
I'll just end with one final thought. When it comes to opinions of coaches, understand that if you put the coaches in the room, they're going to agree on probably 99% of things. That might be a little bit high, but they're going to agree on getting the basics and foundation in place. And, everything beyond that becomes more of a specific way and a specific language of how to coach. Like when people come to me and say, Faz said this, or Jeffrey Verity Schofield said this, like I immediately am on their side. Like I know we're probably saying the same thing in a different way, or we would agree on how to implement it. I don't find, Faz, that most coaches have radically different ideas.
No, not really. No, it's usually just the language they use. And just to kind of like one last thing from me, I would say like I do really appreciate people questioning, because Steve and I are both here to educate people. This is kind of what we do, is what we're on YouTube for. And we're both genuine coaches. We do this for a living. So if you do have questions, like, we're kind of joking by saying you're pitting us against each other. But like, if you do have questions, like by all means ask. I mean, we are here to educate. So if something hasn't been explained quite clearly, then please do ask. That's why we're making this 30-minute video, is to explain the position so you all completely understand where we're coming from. So hopefully that's done that.
Yeah, and you know what? The beautiful thing about what we do for a living is that we get hammered with questions daily, and we're forced to improve our education. Which, at the end of the day, if I don't take my own self-education seriously, I have no business coaching anybody. So that is one reason why when I see somebody in a little box, it makes me a little bit nervous. All right, guys, we appreciate you tuning in. I've taken enough of Faz's time. Please head over to YouTube and subscribe to FAZLIFTS, or head over to Instagram at FAZLIFTS. And if you have a question or comment, drop it down below. If not, we will see you next time. Thanks, Faz.
Cheers, guys.